Okay, so this is the second part of the first section of lectures. In this part, we'll be looking at languages specifically, so kind of specific languages and facts about them, rather than language in general, like we looked at previously. So, as we look at languages more specifically, we'll try to think a little bit about um, kind of how many languages there are, how they interact with each other, that kind of thing. So to start off with, try to think a little bit, um, think about what we've talked about, so that some languages are not yet documented and that we might have trouble distinguishing languages from dialects. So as we saw with Mandarin and Cantonese and Serbian and Croatian. So trying to take some of that into account, think a little bit about how many languages might be spoken in the world today. If you've thought about that for a little bit, or if you pause this and decided to Google it or whatever, you may have actually seen that there's a somewhat surprisingly large amount of languages. So most figures you'll see will be somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages that are actually currently spoken. So not all of these languages, of course, are the same size or are in the same situation. So about 5.5% of these languages have more than 1 million speakers, which means that something like 95% of them have fewer than 1 million. And 55% of languages actually have fewer than 10,000 speakers. And then 94% of the world's population speaks 6% of its languages. So despite having such a wide variety of languages, a lot of the speakers are concentrated in just a few of them. So kind of another pop quiz type question that you're of course not graded on at all is try to guess or think about what 10 languages you think might have the largest number of mother tongue speakers. So basically what we mean here is what 10 languages have the largest number of speakers where someone grew up speaking the language. It was one of the first languages they learned, and this is the language they use the most. So in the top 10, we have Chinese. Notice the asterisk there. Spanish, English, Hindi, and Arabic. So those are actually the top 5. So Chinese has the asterisk because, as you may remember, we had that discussion about what exactly is the difference between a language and a dialect. So the figure for Chinese here does include some of what some linguists might consider to be multiple dialects or multiple languages under the label of one language. So the figures here might consider Mandarin and Cantonese to be the same language, so that's where they get 1.2 billion. So further in the top 10, we will see these languages: Portuguese, Bengali, Russian, Japanese, and Javanese. So a few more languages that are relatively well known. So these top 10 languages all have quite a large number of speakers, in the many millions of speakers. So kind of the next 10, so rounding out the top 20, we have a few more relatively well-known languages, such as German, Korean, French, Turkish, Vietnamese, Urdu. So a lot of relatively well-known languages that are still in the many millions of speakers. So those languages we saw, all those in the top 20, are pretty much in no danger of dying out. However, there's a lot of languages in the world that are what's called endangered. So you've of course heard of endangered species. So some species of animals or plants or any kind of wildlife can become so low in population that they're in danger of dying out completely. you can also see this happen with languages. So around 45% of languages in the world today are endangered. This means that they are in danger of dying out. They have very few speakers left, and the speakers that are left are relatively old, and they're not passing on their knowledge of the language. So once those older speakers die out, there will be no more speakers of the language. Thus, the language is considered endangered. So this language endangerment can be caused by just kind of shifts of patterns of language use in a multilingual community. So there might be a community where there's several languages spoken for whatever reason. One language or a couple languages might become more spoken, and then some of the other languages might become less spoken. So shifts like that can lead to language endangerment. Numbers of speakers in this case can just kind of decline, and languages can just die out if they get too few speakers passing on their knowledge of the language. So this language endangerment can be caused by language shift. So some of those causes of language shift are just kind of dominance of certain languages. So because of education, for example, the education in a region might all be conducted in one language, or the commerce, so kind of business in a region might be conducted by one language. All the media, so all the TV shows, radio, books, that kind of thing, in a region might be kind of dominated by one language. So when one language becomes really dominant, other languages can tend to die out as well. When we see things like urbanization or globalization, we can also see languages start to die out because kind of a centralization of population can sometimes lead to one language becoming dominant because you have so many people in one space and they want some kind of easy way to communicate. It's kind of natural to gravitate towards a more dominant language. You can also see language shift because of national policies. So some countries have created policies where one language is kind of the official language. In some cases, some countries have even decided that certain other languages shouldn't be spoken at all, and through whatever methods have punished people who speak those languages. So there's a few different causes of language shift that can lead to language death. So when a language loses all its speakers, we might want to think a little bit about what is lost. So when we think about what is lost when a language loses its speakers, one way to look at this is what exactly is a language, which we talked about in the previous little video. So one aspect of language is that it's a very cultural thing. So when a language is lost, we lose a lot of the cultural and ethnic identity that its speakers might have had, and we might lose some of the cultural connection to the community where those speakers were. We can lose a lot of folk knowledge, so kind of folk tales or literary tradition, or even just kind of knowledge of the area, knowledge of the plants and animals, that kind of thing. So we can lose a lot of knowledge of the area in addition to the general cultural knowledge. We can also lose kind of a window into how some humans might understand and represent the world. So basically, certain languages might categorize things in a certain way. They might group certain concepts together. They might structure things in a certain way. So when we lose a language, we can sometimes lose the knowledge of how a certain group of people has come to represent the world and has come to experience the world. So basically, when we lose a language and we lose its speakers, we can lose quite a bit of knowledge about the world. So there are some things we can do to kind of mitigate language endangerment and to try to reduce the impact of it. So some of these things we can do are language documentation. So language documentation is when we kind of create a record of a language within its community. So basically this is when a linguist might go and help a community to record the grammar and the vocabulary of its language. There's also language conservation, where a community actually works to promote the use of its languages. So in language documentation, we're just recording the structure and the knowledge of a language, whereas in language conservation, we're actually working to promote the use of the language. Documentation doesn't necessarily promote the use of the language, it just records the knowledge of it. And finally, there's language revitalization, where there's kind of a huge amount of effort put in to strengthen or reestablish a language. So in language revitalization, we might even kind of work to recreate new vocabulary in the language, or to kind of fill in gaps that the language might be missing to deal with the modern world and things like that. So there are a lot of languages in the world, but despite there being so many languages, there's a lot of these languages are relatively small and are kind of in danger of dying out. So basically this kind of epidemic of language endangerment does kind of put us at the risk of losing a lot of linguistic data. So hopefully this little section has kind of given you a bit of knowledge about the situation of languages in the world today. There is actually one more little section we will be looking at, and one more little video lecture. And that one will be about what is linguistics. So far we've looked at language in general, a few languages and their situations more specifically, but this course will be about linguistics and what that is. So that's what the next little section will be about.